Thanks, Georgina. Okay. Thanks for joining us. I wish we were all in a room together and we could actually see each other. So I think that's an easier way of talking to a group than the way we're doing it right now, but we'll do our best. So today we're going to talk about the GLA's Be Seen energy monitoring requirements. It is really important to point out at this stage that although we're talking about the GLA's policy of Be Seen, this is part of a wider context of collecting data and then using it for some kind of compliance. So right now we've got a couple other things happening in the background. We have Ofgem, who will become the regulator for heat networks, probably in about 2 years' time. And we know that Ofgem will also be requiring for heat network operators to collect certain data and submit that as part of compliance for regulations. We'll touch on how these overlap in more detail as we get into the conversation. And there's another that many of you will be familiar with, and that is ESG reporting requirements. So increasingly, the investors who are putting money into the developments that include things like heat networks are requiring reporting of energy, carbon, other utility data back up to fulfill the requirements of investors. Money gets cheaper sometimes, the greener the project. And we're watching this principle of things needing to be monitored and reported on. So collecting data from the right parts of the scheme and then making that data available in the right format to the right stakeholders. We're watching this happen on multiple fronts. And it's all coming together. And luckily, it's starting to look pretty similar. Right, having said that, today we're going to talk about GLA Be Seen in particular. So, London Plan sets out the Be Seen requirement. So you remember from way back in the day, even back in Ken Livingston's time, we had the requirements to start being lean, be lean, be clean, be green. So now we've got Be Seen, and this is where there's a requirement to actually report on how a scheme is operating in order to determine whether it is doing as well as everybody promised during design and delivery. The reason why is because there's a performance gap. We have delivered plenty of schemes making ambitious promises in the energy strategies and during delivery. And then in practice, in actual use of those schemes, reality has turned out to be different from the ambition. GLA is keenly aware of that, and they also know that the way to address that shortfall is to bring in transparency, ensure that those schemes have to show how things are actually going. Now, in the case of planning, this is specifically for major developments. These are the ones that are referable to the GLA, and referable means that the planning application is going to go through the GLA. So anything over 150 dwellings, anything over 30 meters, etc. I want to highlight that the Be Seen requirements apply to any referable application, not just those with heat networks, but I'm going to be talking specifically about the heat network context. That's what we've got the most interesting things to talk about. So interpreting the planning requirements, we're going to break this down into 4 different areas. The first 3 that we're going to talk about are stages within the delivery of a project. And then the 4th is what happens if it's not performing as promised. So the first bit is before building works begin. Second one is as built. So the building has been built, but it's not yet occupied. And then the next one is upon completion. It's actually after the end of the defects and liability period, but we'll get into that in a minute. And then the last one here is, okay, and what happens if we don't do what we said we were going to do? what happens then? It's important to point out that these are already coming through. So here are 3 examples of planning documents that make reference to the Be Seen policy. So we're seeing planning permissions come through that cite this policy. And when you go on the GLA Be Seen kind of help page, you'll see that they've got draft wording for inclusion in planning permission. Right, and we're watching this wording materialize with tweaks. The local authorities have been making little changes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, sometimes around timing to make it more concrete. But this is real, and it's already happening. All right, so let's start with the beginning. Before building works begin. So before commencement of above ground works, maybe you've already done demolition. They seem not to be too worried about that. You need to submit accurate and verified estimates of the KPIs, of the key performance indicators. Accurate and verified. Well, an accurate estimate, you could be forgiven for thinking that might be difficult to pull off. Because you can't know at this stage. You're going to be making the best estimate that you can. Verified means they've kind of hedged their bets a little bit here, and they talk about not using an external party, and so a third party to pull together your estimates of this. You're not marking your own homework. As for who you use and who would be acceptable, they're not completely specific about that. You have to submit that information to the GLA's monitoring portal. And so if you've been on there, or maybe you haven't been on there yet, they have some web forms that you use for submitting this information. Something that's worth pointing out. So if you've been through that process of having your consultants, or maybe you are one of those consultants, writing an energy strategy, and then submitting that as part of the planning application, you know that, well, things can be a little loose at that stage, right? We're at the very early stages of the design, it's concept stage. So you've got to be cautious about what you're committing to at that stage. I think this has been recognized because what you see in the actual documents that are coming through is that the planning authorities are getting a little extra time, including post-planning, so after the energy strategy's gone in, to come back with the estimates of the energy KPIs. That means, like, you've got some extra time to ensure that, in the case of a heat network, you understand more about how that heat network is going to work. Even though it's not been through detailed design yet, you understand enough to put your outline figures in. So they seem to recognize this need to work up the concept a little bit more than you might at the energy study stage. Here are some examples of those KPIs. So I'm not going to go into them in detail. They're laid out really clearly. In fact, this is just a screenshot from the GLA guidance document. So it's definitely worth going in there. If you scroll all the way, or very nearly all the way to the bottom of that document, you'll see a table that lays out really clearly what the KPIs are at each stage. So those first 3 stages that we talked about. But they are things like kilowatt hour count for electricity consumption, gas consumption, district heating and cooling consumption. They have this concept of a reportable unit. So what is it that has to be reported on? And it's crucial to point out that reportable units include dwellings and energy centers, right? So you need to have these KPIs, not just while you might be summing to a site level, you have to have the data. I've estimated that data at this stage for each individual dwelling and non-domestic. Okay, so we move into completion of the as-built design for each phase. So then within 4 months of practical completion of each phase, updated, accurate, and verified estimates of the Be Seen energy performance indicator. So what's happened by this stage? Well, you've probably been through commissioning by this point. So you should have much clearer data now about how the system as installed is performing. Okay, there's no people in there yet. So these are, at this stage, you've got to use the best metrics that you can to ensure that you're on track to achieve the overall performance that you promised. Again, you need to take these figures and you need to upload them on the GLA planning portal. At this stage, you also have to demonstrate that you've got suitable monitoring devices in there, right? That you're gonna be able to measure all those KPIs in the next phase of compliance with Be Seen. This would include things like metering in all your dwellings, a means of remotely reading those meters, capturing that data, showing that your energy center, including at the boundary of the energy center where heating and cooling is provided to the site, as well as upstream of the generation plant, because you're going to have to talk about conversion efficiency of your incoming fuel, right? So you have to have each stage of that energy chain in your site included in the way that you monitor, including all dwellings. Okay, so again, I'm not going to go into it on the KPI side, but what you see at the bottom, nearly the bottom of that GLA guidance document is that it pretty much says, here's what you've got to estimate, here's what you've got to have revised estimates of at asphalt time, and here's what you've got to actually measure. There's consistency across through those phases. They don't change radically. There are tweaks, but they don't change radically as you go from first to second to third stage. Okay, and then, well, your site is going to go into DLP. Interestingly, the guidance says from the end of DLP, which they estimate to be 6 to 12 months, right? I think they say rarely longer than 12 months. We have seen DLPs longer than that, but in any case, from the end of DLP and 4 or 5 years, you need to be providing accurate and verified annual in-use energy performance data. So this is what's actually happening on the site. Now, verified in this context is pretty interesting. They talk about using things like display energy certificate data. So in earlier stages, they refer to SAP data as a means of estimating. And at this stage, they talk about the display energy certificate data. This guidance was drafted probably 2020-ish. It was published in September 2021, but I think it was drafted significantly before that. And different things have happened in the meantime. One of the things that has happened is the emergence of the heat network technical assurance scheme as part of upcoming regulations. So we know that Ofgem is coming in as the regulator. We know that Ofgem is going to require certain technical standards to be met on heat networks, and that heat networks are going to have to report that to Ofgem. So whereas the original spirit of providing verified data may have meant DECs, display energy certificates, I can easily imagine that in future it's going to be the same data set, or at least largely the same data set as the one that's being collected and provided to Ofgem. In fact, if you look at timeframes, there may be reporting to Ofgem going on before you're reporting on Be Seen. They may be contemporaneous. We'll see how this plays out. They give consideration to how things are reported in line with GDPR, so for data protection regulations. And they want things to be aggregated enough to hide individual households. And they draw that line in general at 5 dwellings. So the minimum size of a unit that's being reported against is 5 dwellings. It could be more, it could be aggregated across a larger number of dwellings. But the really important thing to emphasize here is that it's taking data from individual dwellings and then aggregating it, rather than just taking, say, bulk meter data from further upstream in the heat network. Again, you upload to the planning portal. What you'll see is that this bit isn't done yet on the portal. There's some time before it's going to be needed. They've got the first 2 web forms done, but they haven't got this one done. We'll see if in future, rather than just web forms, there's something like an API. We expect there to be an API, so an application program interface, where it's just a way of 2 servers to talk to each other without intervention from a human. And we expect to see that on the wherever compliance is required, like GLA or with Ofgem in the future. We would expect to be that. We expect to see that submittable via something like an API. Same deal with the KPIs. I won't get into the detail. Please peruse at your leisure. Okay, and then here's a crucial bit. So what happens if you're not complying? Well, if the in-use evidence that you submit shows that the estimates haven't been met or not being met for 2 consecutive years, then you got to submit a plan. You got to submit a plan of how you're going to make it better. It has to be based on measures that are reasonably practicable to implement. Now, what we've seen is, in principle, if it's something that should have been done in project delivery, then there's not a lot of leeway, right? You've got to go back and you've got to put it right. That plan gets submitted to the GLA. It gets approved by the local planning authority, implemented by the owner. There isn't a lot of information in the guidance about what happens if the plan doesn't work or if you don't submit a plan. What we would expect is that that will get clarified further down the line. And just on principle, if you were going back for your next planning permission and your last one wasn't working out so well, then you might get an awfully rough ride. There will be something similar on the Ofgem side, almost certainly, where if you're not meeting certain technical standards, you'll have to submit a plan for putting them right, and you'll have a certain amount of time to do it. Now, in that case, it's purely regulatory, which means that there's a clearer stick. The stick in this case, in the case of Be Seen, is not quite so clear. Okay, so when we talk about using technology, using data to support compliance with Be Seen, there's a couple of stages to emphasize. One of them is the concept design, which I was talking about earlier, right? It's that early stage of the design where you've probably written your energy strategy and you're firming up the detail. Well, one way of filling in those details, that uncertainty about how this thing is going to perform, is by using past projects. If you've got any projects that you've constructed in the past, hopefully they're working really well, and that data gives you some place to start at design stage. Similarly, at technical design, the more you can inform your technical design from past projects, the more confidence you can have that you are setting good goals, right? Because sandbagging presumably is going to get picked up. So we got to set good goals, but then you can actually achieve them. The next stage to emphasize when we're talking about using technology is at handover, or more importantly, just before handover, where you're commissioning a system. You want to ensure that that system is measured as performing well before you go to practical completion. You don't want your main contractor or the subcontractors to get paid until that scheme is doing what everybody promised. And we'll talk a little bit more about what technology to use, but you're pulling real data out of that site to show that it's doing what was promised. And then finally, in number 7, which is those 5 years, you want to be monitoring that heat network to spot and fix problems that arise over that period. So let's dig into this just a little bit more. First bit, before building works begin. So here is a histogram of flow rate from a plant room, right? This is, for anybody who's not used to staring at histograms, in the horizontal axis, we've got the flow rate going from 0 on the left-hand side up to about 9 cubic meters an hour on the right-hand side. And then the vertical axis is the number of hours in the last year that the plant room was running at that flow rate. Okay, so every time you take a meter read from that plant room, you check the flow rate and you drop it in the right bucket. And each of those buckets fills up at different rates, and then you end up with something that looks like a skewed normal curve, kind of like this thing. So this site spends most of its time at something like 300 liters an hour, or 0.3 of a cubic meter an hour. And 99% of the time it's less than 3.4 cubic meters an hour. And I can't really see anything at 4.5. So this is an indicator, depending on what loads are downstream of this meter, an indicator of the kinds of flow rate that you can expect in practice. And what we see all the time is oversizing. We always see, or frequently see, designers terrified about peaks, terrified about having enough heat at the farthest point on the network, and therefore adding these buffers of uncertainty on top of each other, and they add up in a hurry. And when you do that, what happens is you can't operate down at the low end where the system is going to spend most of its time, right? So in this case, sort of 300 liters an hour. So you want to take your data sets from the previous schemes. You want to make sure that they're informing your estimates of your next project. Here's another way of looking at this. This is a plot, like a scatter plot, but the more of these little dots that, or squares that you build up, the more the color changes. So it's like a heat map scatter plot. Across the horizontal axis is our flow rate in cubic meters an hour, and up the vertical axis is delta T. And what you want to see from your scheme is that regardless of the flow rate, you're always operating with a high delta T, right? And with this scheme, actually, we're pretty happy. You can see that all of our little rectangles are in a sort of a horizontal line. And you can see that they're almost entirely falling between this 30 and 40 degree delta T lines. So we're pretty happy here. So data from this kind of scheme could happily be taken to inform a new design. Now, if you've got a dog, if you've got a scheme that's not performing well, then you'd see it in this graph, and you certainly wouldn't want to be baking that in, because 1, you might be accused of sandbagging, and 2, it's certainly nothing to model your next scheme on. Section B, so on completion of each phase, here is an example of using data to verify commissioning. So Guru Verify is a mobile and web app that's used for acceptance testing. This is something that you find in the code of practice for heat network CP1. It's something that we would expect to see a lot more of in future as regulations take hold. This idea that you need to pull out the data and prove how things are working before practical completion. It makes things transparent to all the stakeholders. That means that whether you're the person who commissioned that scheme, or you're the contractor who's overseeing subbies, or potentially even you're a consultant who needs to see how things turned out in the real world. This then brings in that data and then makes sure that the right stakeholders have visibility of it so that everybody can be held to account. You can also see in voltmeter and plant room data how schemes are behaving. And you can see that before occupation. You can start to see how the scheme is behaving sometimes you'll hear this feedback from certain parts of the supply chain where they'll say, oh yeah, it's not working now, but as soon as it's all occupied, it's going to be fine. And that is, well, it's just not true. It's a way of kicking the can down the road. It needs to work when there's nobody in the scheme. Now it'll behave differently when people are living there. You'll see different patterns in the data, but it still needs to work when demand is as of an unoccupied site. So I'll just quickly tell you that this is a graph straight out of Pinpoint, as they've all been, where we've got the flow temperature in blue and the return temperature in green, and then we've got the instantaneous load in yellow. And you can see that the blue and the green are just sitting flat at about 60-30, completely boring, which is exactly what we want to see. And all the variation is in the power output from the plant. So this is pointing out that regardless of the output, regardless of how much heat the site is calling for, the plant room is just doing its thing, and it's being super efficient and keeping return temperatures down. And then in occupation, it's not enough to just gather the data, format it, and submit it. You have to make use of that data and monitor your scheme. Because what we see again and again is where nobody's watching, the performance on a heat network will drift over time. And that's what this graph is showing us. This is a graph of delta T at the plant room over about 15 months. And the delta T is not so bad, sort of 25 plus on the left-hand side, not stellar, but not bad. And then you can see over those 15 months that it just drifts down and down and down until you get to the right-hand side of this graph where it is touching zero frequently. And on average, it might be sort of 4 or 5 degrees of delta T. And that means that your return temperatures are too high. Your heat losses from your return pipework, which is half your network, is too high. Your plant at the plant room might not be performing as well. So your COP on your large heat pump or your CHP, if you still got one, maybe that's not running. Your boilers certainly wouldn't be condensing in this case. So these knock-on effects, where before they were hidden, now surface in the data that has to be submitted to the GLA. If all you did was collect that data and submit it and think, hey, I'm done, then pretty soon you're going to have GLA knocking on your door saying, well, this isn't acceptable. You need to identify the measures to put this right and implement them. So there is a use for this data. There's an internal use for this that they are pushing towards. This isn't just a compliance thing. This is a push towards the operator having sight of this data and making use of it in order to ensure that the system is working. Here is spotting when something goes wrong in a dwelling. So again, we've got so this is a dwelling level view. This is flow temps in blue and return temp in green. And you can see that at, what is that, about 9 a.m. there in the middle of that graph, 11th of May, that this dwelling suddenly started behaving really badly. And what you see when you add flow rate to this dwelling is that it was sitting down very, very low, and then suddenly it leaps up. So now you've got a whole bunch of water gushing through this HIU and returning to the heat network very hot, again, dragging up those return temperatures with all the consequent effects, and swamping its good performing neighbors. You have to take your operational data, including at the dwelling level, and ensure that these problems are being caught. Otherwise, you're going to get what we saw in the previous graph, which is your delta T declining over time. And that's when you're getting a call. So some things to emphasize, tools that we provide with this kind of thing in mind. So bringing transparency to heat networks, ensuring that the data is captured and then available to the right stakeholders at the right time. On the left-hand side, we've got your Pinpoint, which is our SaaS platform for data visualization and analysis. That's where, particularly in operation, the operators would use this to ensure that everything is working as planned. Pure Integrate in the middle is a means of talking directly, in this case to an Altechnic HIU, but in future it will be others, to be able to configure that in operation without accessing the dwelling. So you can change its settings without knocking on a door, which can help to improve heat network performance for really low cost. And on the right-hand side is Guru Verify, which facilitates acceptance testing. We've already talked that one through. So thanks very much, and we'll see if we've got any questions.
Thanks, Casey. Yes, do actually have two questions in the Q&A at the moment. I'll take them one after the other. So the first refers to what you were saying around section C. It says, is section C still based on calculated or comparing against SAP data? That's section C is the in-use data capture.
So it's in-use data. But what we've got to do is you are reporting back against the expectation that was set previously. So you have to capture real world data, and you are then going, you're then going to be checked for how consistent that is with what came through before. We don't know exactly how tight that's going to have to be, but what's clear is that if you've set requirements and then you badly miss them, then they are going to be holding you to account. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Not at this stage, no, I think so. The second question is one we might have to take away though. It says, how does it work with the legal owner if it's, if performance, sorry, I need to read this properly, sorry. How does it work with the legal owner if it's because the airlocks in the radiators in the residential plots where they have been handed over to the residents? That's the question. That's
right.
Is in the chat.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, certainly at handover stage, you're going to have to show that the systems inside the dwellings were well balanced and performing, resulting in the return temperatures. So you'll have to have the data that shows that it's working at that point. In future, if there was a problem that was caused by behavior in the dwelling or somebody making a change to the system, then provided you had that original data to fall back on, maybe you've got some leeway. It's totally, there's no precedent for this just yet. But what we do know is that the behavior, so HIUs are typically inside the dwelling. The behavior of the HIU, behavior of the heat network overall is influenced heavily by the behavior of the HIU, which is in turn influenced heavily by the systems inside that dwelling. So you have to have a mechanism of ensuring end-to-end performance, and it's not going to be sufficient, I think, to point to a closed door saying that we can't get through that, therefore we can't fix this problem, we can't fix this heat network.
Got two more questions that relate to section C of in-use data, so I'm going to take them both at the same time. The first one is relates to the graph that we showed about delta T degrading over time. Says, what do you think the key issues are behind this? I'll take that one first, and then I'll do a follow-up.
Let's see. So often what we find is that, you remember the second graph, this one. Yes, I can. Okay, so this shows a single dwelling and the moment when, well, somebody was called out for a reactive maintenance visit. And what they did when they were in that dwelling was to effectively uncommission the HIU. This probably fixed the problem as perceived by the resident. It could be that the technician and the resident put their hands on a radiator at that moment and it felt very hot, and that resident was then satisfied and the technician thought, okay, great job done, and walked off. So we often see that heat network performance will degrade because of human intervention, and the humans who are intervening most often are the technicians who are responding to call outs. So it tends to happen at the dwelling level. Sometimes you'll get things that are broken that aren't a result. You know, you might have a valve head come off or some other problem, but it tends to be because of maintenance visits.
And we've got another question about section C. So it says section C states accurate and verified data. What's your definition of verified?
It's going to have to be from real meters measuring real data. It can't be estimates, and it can't be your estimates. That's our interpretation of that right now. I think that this is where we're going to see more alignment between GLA and off-gem, for example, where verified in the heat network context may mean in line with the heat network technical assurance requirements and the reporting requirements into off-gem. It may be the same data set that's going in both directions, and the same regulation applies to both on collection. So it may be going through an accredited assurance provider or similar.
And then a couple of questions relating to the technology that we provide. The first is Guru System an independent party that has been appointed by the GLA to help monitor performance and identify issues to be fixed, or are there other options and means to monitor and improve performance?
Yeah, so this isn't exclusive to us. We spend all day, every day trying to do a good job at helping people digitalize, gather data, make use of that data, right? So this is where our expertise comes from, and we've got 10 years of experience of gathering data, getting into the hands of the right stakeholders at the right time. It's also a topic that's near and dear to our hearts because of what the company is here to accomplish. There are other solutions available. I guess what's important to emphasize is it's not enough to just install meters and hope to be compliant that way. The meter is the first thing, right? The meter is going to be measuring kilowatt hours and then some underlying technical information that you'll need to spot problems and put them right, like flow and return temperatures and flow rates and so on. So the meter contains that data. You've got to get that data out. And you've got to get that data out in a way, in a format and a frequency that allows you to address any performance, identify and address performance issues on your network. As I mentioned before, that data will also then be used by clients. So you've got to use metering to measure, use a system to get the right data out to allow you to monitor and remediate your system if needed. And then you need to ensure that that data is sort of transformed, if you like, and put into the hands of the right stakeholders, including folks like the GLA or the local authority that gave you the planning permission in the first place, or off-gem, or your ESG, your lender or your investor for the scheme who has ESG requirements. That same kind of data set then that's the end link in the chain. It's not enough just to do one bit, you have to have the whole thing. So there could be other solutions to solving all that. I think that we do that really well because that's what we do all day. But no, this isn't exclusive to us.
And one quick question saying, can Guru Verify be purchased as a standalone package?
Yes, it can.
And a last And a last question, which I think is going to be all we've got time for, do the GLA Be Seen, or does the GLA Be Seen initiative require data to be graphically available on a monitor or screen device to maintenance staff or tenants?
I don't think so. Do you?
I haven't seen requirements around that.
I haven't seen that. It could be a nice add-on, but I haven't seen that as a requirement.
Okay, thank you everyone for your questions and for staying to the end here. We will be making sure that the recording is available if you need to catch up or send to a colleague. If you have any follow-up questions, please do get in touch with us via all the usual means, and we'll get straight back to you. Have a nice day.